Expanders, on the other hand, what they do is they expand the dynamic range. So above a certain threshold, it starts expanding the dynamic range. So above the threshold, then a small change in the input allows for a larger change in the output. That's how that works. As I said, once you compress something, to uncompress it and expand it again, it's not going to come back the same way because you've already adjusted the frequency content in the sound by shaping the envelope differently. So here's an example of an expander that actually comes in Pro Tools. When do you use an expander? For me, it's a more corrective tool. You can use it for whatever you like. But the problem is if I'm doing a mix and the acoustic's sitting perfectly in the verse, but when I get to the chorus, I lose it entirely. I could write a level up, or I could try to expand it so it has more dynamics. Or where somebody's overcompressed something like an acoustic guitar, and when they finger pick, it's as loud as when they're strumming. That's sort of unnatural, because you know that an acoustic guitar picked is going to be quieter than when you're really beating on it, strumming it. It just doesn't correspond with how we normally hear stuff. Here's another example of what it is. The expander has an attack time and a release time very similar to a compressor. The last is the gate. What it is an on-off kind of switch. They've modified it so you can gate so much, bring the level down a certain amount or not. I use gates quite often to control bleed from one mic to the next. So if I'm in a live situation and I've got a drum set up and I've got microphones on the toms and I'm getting too much bleed of the other instruments into my microphones, I'll put a gate on them, and the gate basically shuts and keeps no signal from going through until you reach the threshold, and then they open and allow the signal to go through. So when they hit the tom, then all of a sudden they open, you get the tom, and then they slowly shut down again after the tom plays, and then they stay closed. So you can stop bleeding from other sound sources that are quieter than the one you're trying to capture. It's a really useful tool. The other thing is it can be used very similarly to a compressor, but with a almost infinite ratio. So it shuts it down completely or opens it completely. Gates also have the opposite, which is a ducking function. The trigger is like the sidechain. When the trigger gets a signal, it just reduces the level 10 dB. I do that quite often on a snare drum when I've got the hi-hat really loud playing and the snare drum has so much hi-hat bleed into it because they're very close in proximity on the drum kit. I'll take on the snare drum and put a gate on it and only reduce the level like 10 decibels. So when he hits the snare, it doesn't all of a sudden open up and you hear cymbals going on and then closes. It just sort of controls gently the loudness of other elements that are around that you wanted to discriminate against. But sometimes it's very difficult when you've got a drum kit or you've got a band in one room and everybody's loud, all the microphones are picking up everybody else. And you want to use something to sort of help discriminate what you're trying to hear from what you are actually getting into the microphone. That's what a gate is. I mean, they call it a gate for a reason. It's almost like, you've got your front yard gate. You either open it or close it. You open it, you can pass. If you close it, you can't get in. And so basically, in the beginning, they were open and close valves, basically, that you could open from a third input, which is called a trigger. So when it gets triggered, it opens. And then it lets the signal through, then it closes. And you can control how fast it closes and how fast it opens. That's how it started. Then they said, well, wait a minute, we can do better than that. We can put another control on there that's going to allow you to only open it halfway and then close it. Or open it just a bit to let a little signal through and then close it. Then they said, well, we can also do the opposite, called ducking instead of gating, where when it gets a trigger signal, we take the signal that's going through the gate and pull it down, which is very similar to what a compressor does. Here's the big picture, how we were drawing the input versus the output, the input being on the horizontal and the output being on the vertical. And let me point out what each thing is because it all relates. So here, this down here on the bottom is actually gating and then expanding. And then the 45 here is a 1-to-1 ratio, which means what comes in comes out the same. Then compression, and then limiting on the top. So this all relates into one big picture of dynamic control. These are all dynamically controlled elements. They have different names and different uses, but the gate versus the compressor this shows you why they're different and how they're different. And incidentally, the slope of this compressor line, if it was less sloped or more sloped, would be what the ratio is. The higher the ratio, the more slope it is. Because I love compressors, last but not least, there's the pull-up type compressor. Instead of pushing down the loud stuff to limit dynamics, you can push up the soft stuff. There's a compressor that I use almost every day. It's a Waves compressor called the MV2. It has two controls. One is to pull down the loud stuff, and one is to push up the soft stuff. It comes in very handy for things like tambourines. When a tambourine's hitting hard, pull down controls how loud it gets. When they're shaking it, all those little in-between shakes, those chicka chicka, chicka chicka, chicka, those little in-between shakes sometimes need to come up so that you can actually hear them and you don't hear just the hard beats. Push up the soft stuff and pull down the loud stuff, and I can control it in a mix in terms of its volume. And then you can hear all the nuances of the instrument. It limits dynamics by limiting how quiet things can get. So it pushes up the soft stuff, which you can control how much you push it up, and pulls down the loud stuff. So you basically are squishing the dynamic range in both directions rather than just the top and then raising all of it. It's a really handy compressor. I use it on drums, especially a drummer that's got a little bit of drag stuff, little stuff in there where he's sort of dragging on the snare in between massive hits. And that's great because then you hear all those little press rolls that he's doing and all that stuff, and you can bring them up loud enough so they don't get lost in the mix. Overcompressing. Overcompressing will take out too much dynamics, makes it hard to sound natural, hard to mix that way because then when the band is getting louder but your vocal isn't, it gets buried in the mix. So it's hard to give it any ebb and flow because it's so overdone in terms of it having no dynamic range. And you always have to be careful because you can't undo the compression. You can't really undo compression if you record compression in a sound. You can always change a plugin if it's after the fact. So in the beginning of my recording career, I actually tried to stay away from compressors, but now I've gotten to the point where I'm so comfortable with it that I just slam compression on things because it sounds better and I love it. I just love compressed sounds. It really does make things sound better. So if you walk away with nothing from this lecture, remember, sounds that are compressed sound better.